All right, this is Andy Kaufman Revealed, Best Friend Tells All by Bob Zmuda. Zmuda? Zmuda? Something like that. So this is, of course, a book about Andy Kaufman, but that's not really going to be the focus of this review. Well, it is and it isn't. This book was published in 1999. And this, of course, was released around the same time as the movie Man on the Moon about Andy Kaufman, the biographical picture about Andy Kaufman. So I got this because I was really fascinated by the movie and I grew up without a television, so when I really didn't know anything about Andy Kaufman until the movie came out, and I watched it, and I was fascinated, kind of morbidly so, with Andy Kaufman and his character that he came up with. Let's see if I can. Tony Clifton, the Tony Clifton character. I had done similar stunts with some prosthetic teeth and all, so I was like, wow, this is crazy. Somebody else has done this. So anyway, so I was really fascinated. I saw this book at a Half Price Books here in Dallas and picked it up and read it all the way through. Really fascinating stuff. But what's really interesting, what will probably interest most of you watching this, is the first part of this about Bob Zmuda talking about his kind of prologue, introducing himself and introducing how he met Andy Kaufman. He talks about, tells the story of a screenwriter that he was paid, he claims, $1,000 a week to assist this screenwriter, an Oscar-nominated screenwriter who is very eccentric and would go around in a limousine. And Bob's job was to carry multiple tape recorders and record all of this guy's interactions with other people. And supposedly he was using this for his writing of screenplays. And this gentleman was allegedly an Oscar-nominated screenwriter, and would go around and create these bizarre situations, which I'll get into here in a minute. And he was recording all these on these tape recorders that Bob Zmuda would play. And then he had a backup tape player that he would also carry around with a tape marked Catch 22, I think it was, that he would put in the tape player and play in an emergency, that he had this whole protocol in case some kind of emergency arose from this. So what he describes here is really interesting. And again, this is just the first part of this book. I've got it marked to here. Maybe the first 20 or 30 pages of this book are devoted to his accounts of Mr. X. And at the time the book was published, he claimed this is so inflammatory that he didn't want to name or out Mr. X for who he was. And in the stories he recounts, he talks about in one case, they go to a donut shop and basically pay everybody. He buys everything in the donut shop except the one glazed donut that he was denied early on. He goes to the register, and anyway, he creates all these bizarre situations and then tries to bribe people with money to do sometimes obscene acts and things. One incident, he went into the birthday party of an old Italian woman that was allegedly the mother or grandmother of some kind of mafia don or something, and then he proceeds to insult her, and they allegedly were taken into the back of this Italian restaurant and held at gunpoint, about to be executed for insulting this Italian woman. And he recounts all of this and all of these crazy things that he then was recording with the tape recorder slung around his neck. It wasn't like a hidden camera stunt. He was literally walking around with a recorder. And all of this, if I remember right, took place in the early 70s or mid 70s, before he met Andy Kaufman. And one of the reasons he met Andy Kaufman was the crazy stories he told about Mr. X, went around the comedy circuit, and Andy Kaufman heard about this. And anyway, so those of you who've read about Mr. X will definitely no, your alarm bells will go off about this guy, because it's a lot of his behavior is very similar to a lot of weird occult behavior, ritual abuse behavior. I mean, the man was definitely mentally ill. If not, there's not a cow in Texas. But there was something very, very, very wrong with this guy. But this guy had a lot of money, and one of the things Bob Zmuda claimed that his job was to pay off all these people. So not only would they try to pay people to do obscene acts and whatnot, but they would also pay off the people who did not cooperate and buy their cooperation. Police officers, whoever. So really strange stuff. And I'm just going to read part of this, because this is one little bit of writing that stuck with me for the last 20 some years or so. Let's see. So at this point in the story, he and I got to hand it to Bob Zmuda. His writing on this like I said, this stuck in my brain for a long time. But at this particular point in his story with Mr. X, this is kind of his breaking point with Mr. X, where they go to an airport and they're about to buy tickets to fly somewhere, and they're standing in line, and Mr. X says, "I got to take a expletive." I got to take an expletive. Of course, he's saying the word for number 2, shall we say. "I got to take a blank," was Mr. X's simple declaration. Assuming that he had said that so I would hold our place, I turned after a moment to see that he had merely stepped out of line a few feet and dropped his pants and squatted. I had seen pretty much everything in the previous 3 weeks, but this caused my mouth to fall open. There is a form of social denial in crowds when a person begins to act antisocially or in a strange way. People tend to look the other way or stare impassively. Even when a woman is being raped or a man is having a heart attack, a sort of paralysis often overcomes people. They watch but do nothing. So when this seedy, odoriferous psychopath hunkered down and began to void his bowels, people looked on but pretended it wasn't really happening. I was absolutely stunned, since Mr. X was constantly eating garbage, drinking to excess, and generally treating his system like a nuclear Superfund site. His waste material was not only foul, it was unholy. As if he were the Bhopal disaster, people in line began to flee his poisonous emanations. Yet it was a child who finally said something, exactly as in the Emperor's New Clothes. "Mommy," the little girl who had even bigger eyes than the kids on one of those black velvet paintings, "that man is going poo-poo." Indeed he was. And at that, as that sickening spray of noxious loose stool issued forth, a woman screamed, then another. My recorder recorded. Mr. X grunted. I winced. Then the police arrived. And I'll stop there. But so the interesting thing in this account, he recounts several major events, as it were, with Mr. X, and claims he only worked for him for about 3 or 4 weeks. And it was just so completely insane that after this event and after paying off all the cops, he bolted and was done. This book is worth it just for that account, because in light of, again, if you're watching these videos and you're watching some of my reviews on other subjects, this guy's behavior and the way he's documenting his behavior smacks of a lot of weird occultic behavior, a lot of other similar kind of behavior, almost not quite on snuff film level, obviously nobody's dying, but a similar kind of voyeuristic element is at play in some of this. Well, it turns out later, I did a lot of research after I read this. Of course, I read this when the internet was relatively young, and I had a tough time running down. I had a few candidates in mind, but it wasn't for several more years before I finally stumbled onto who the identity of Mr. X was. Norman Wexler, the screenwriter Norman Wexler. So you can go check him out on Wikipedia or wherever. But when you read this account, it really makes you wonder what was really going on behind the scenes with Norman Wexler and who all he was connected to. Because one of the interesting things too that he talks about in this is he gives a very specific account of in this final encounter where things really went off the rails, where the cops were about to arrest this guy. He plays this tape that said Catch 22 on it, and it gives instructions to the police why they should not arrest this guy. And he claims that this was the instructions were given by someone with a very recognizable voice and obviously a notable personality of the day. And part of the instructions were to pull out a picture of this particular celebrity with his arm around or posing with Norman Wexler. And that was enough to get the cops to back off. So there's some really interesting elements to this story. And I'm curious if any of you have also stumbled onto the story of Mr. X and have any thoughts about that. Because again, think about this occurred probably around the time of the Son of Sam murders and a lot of other strange things that were going on in New York around that time. And it begs the question of what exactly were Bob Zmuda's connections, what were Norman Wexler's connections, because obviously this was a very mentally ill guy, but a very well-funded mentally ill guy. So anyway, I'll leave it there. This is a fascinating book. There's a lot of stuff in here. It's a fascinating portrait of Andy Kaufman. I'm on the fence as to whether or not the guy faked his death or not. Allegedly, a few years ago, there was a guy that came forth saying he was Andy Kaufman and that he had faked his death. I don't really have any strong opinions one way or the other, but it does make you wonder. When you read this, you can't help but wonder if he retired his public persona to go off and work in the intelligence business, because a lot of his behavior is very much like a lot of modern psychological warfare efforts. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Andy Kaufman Revealed by Bob Zmuda, published in 1999.